We're living and meeting tonight at a very dangerous moment in world events and world history, a very fraught moment. The Trump administration, fully backed by the Democratic Party and the media, launched a violent and illegal attack on Syria. It's dropped a horrific bomb, the largest bomb since the atomic bombs dropped on Japan in 1945 on Afghanistan, a horrifying bomb. Ultimately, the target here is Russia in the case of the Middle East, where nuclear-armed powers face each other in the region. Meanwhile, Trump threatens to launch an attack on North Korea, which is ultimately aimed at China. And that, too, would find universal support in the American establishment. Truly, and the United States, of course, is not alone in this. France, England, the other various powers are involved as well. The ruling classes everywhere are hurtling toward disaster and threaten humanity as part of that. Though in our view, a great deal depends on the development of the working class everywhere, its political and social, cultural consciousness, as the only force that can stop the imperialist war drive which threatens the future of humanity. And we're taking up tonight's subject, which may seem somewhat distant from that in that context. What are the great questions of our time? In our view, social inequality, the threat of dictatorship, the drive to war, and the unification of the working class across all ethnic and national lines politically against this rotting system is decisive. However, if you were to go by the media and large portions of the academic world in the United States, and not only the United States, when they are not repeating lies about Syria or Russia or Iran or North Korea, every important question of social life revolves around or reduces itself to either race or gender. And this is a deliberate and reactionary attempt to divert attention from the most burning questions and channel sections of the middle class, in particular, in the most selfish and self-pitying directions. Moreover, there's a profound connection between the emergence and flourishing of upper middle class identity politics, race and gender politics, and the growth of a new constituency for imperialist wars. Because these layers, newly or not so newly wealthy, turning to the right, to the defense of the system, the defense of their wealth, are especially susceptible to propaganda about, or in some cases the most aggressive advocates of, neo-colonial invasions and wars in the name of human rights, democratic rights, women's rights, gay rights, the whole fraud of American policy. And the exposure of this ideological and political trend is thus vital to the struggle against war and imperialist barbarism. Now, in regard to the dishonest and politically driven fixation with race, in particular the New York Times, the newspaper of record, one of the most influential big business media outlets in this country, sets the tone on a regular basis. These are just a few of its recent headlines. The real reason black kids benefit from black teachers, which was an op-ed piece the other day, which is basically an argument for resegregation and for separate and equal. That is to say, to go back 120 years. A history of race and racism in America in 24 chapters. Race in America, racial progress or racist progress. Girls go missing and Washington's racial divide yawns wider. What racial terms make you cringe? Fighting racial bias on campus. How should parents teach their children about race and racism? Racial progress is real, but so is racist progress. Affluent and black and still trapped by segregation. Are we raising races? No racial barrier left to break except all of them. New York Times employees ponder what racial terms are offensive. Now this is not, and this is just a small sampling of recent articles. Now this is not innocent. This is not the honest concern of a democratically inclined publication with the fate of the African American population. This is the publication that speaks for major sections of Wall Street and big business, that has been a leading lying propagandist for war and violence in Iraq, Libya, Syria, which has resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands or millions, and the publication that now ferociously pushes the anti-Russian campaign, which threatens the world, as I say, with a nuclear war. This is part of a larger process. And to cite a couple of recent incidents of the sort of racialization of American culture, 2 out of dozens, I mentioned this, the attack on Free State of Jones, the film, which you may or may not be familiar with, 2016 drama directed by Gary Ross, featuring Matthew McConaughey, about a white man, a small farmer in Mississippi, who led a revolt against the Confederacy in the midst of the Civil War. It was an extraordinary story. And in fact, Southern small farmer and artisan opposition to the Confederacy and slavery was far more extensive than we know. And it's a history that's been largely ignored or concealed. Now, this film provoked particular anger in the identity politics world. The film was condemned as a white savior work. This is Charles Blow in the New York Times, led the charge against the film. He wrote that the film, quote, emphasizes white heroism and centers on the ally instead of the enslaved. It tries desperately to cast the Civil War and specifically dissent within the Confederacy as more a populism versus elitism class struggle in which poor white men were forced to fight a rich white man's war and protect the cotton trade rather than equally a conflict about the moral abhorrence of black slavery. Throughout, there is the white liberal insistence that race is merely a subordinate construction of class. What liberals he has in mind at this point in time is a question. But basically, we wrote a lengthy reply, Blow and the others are offended by Free State of Jones because it argues that great historical events cannot be explained in racial or ethnic terms. On the basis of the Times columnist's outlook, one simply cannot understand why hundreds of thousands of white people died to end slavery. It was not an honest attack, it was a dishonest attack. And it was an attack on a film that more or less accurately reflected the historical truth of this extraordinary event. Then we have more recently, and we've written extensively about this, which is circulated widely. Again, I don't know whether you're familiar with this on the West Coast or not, but there was an attack. This is the painter at the top, a woman by the name of Dana Schutz, and she did a painting based on a photograph of Emmett Till, the 14-year-old black youth who was viciously murdered in Mississippi in 1955 for allegedly flirting with a white woman. And of course, very famously, Emmett Till's mother insisted on an open casket so the world could see what had been done to her son, because he was horribly beaten and disfigured. And it was one of the episodes that outraged millions in the United States and in fact spurred the development of the civil rights movement. So there was a controversy about the painting, which appeared at the Biennial, which is a major art event at the Whitney Museum in New York City. And protests began at the Whitney because the painting of Till was done by a white woman. And an open letter was circulated by Hannah Black, a video artist living in Berlin, demanding that the painting be removed and destroyed. She didn't say whether it should be burned in a public square, but she insisted it should be destroyed. And we responded quite strongly to this, in our view, deeply reactionary and in fact sinister attack. And then the open letter, this is her. The open letter contended that open casket, that is the painting, quote, should not be acceptable to anyone who cares or pretends to care about black people, because it's not acceptable for a white person to transmute black suffering into profit and fun, though the practice has been normalized for a long time. Of course, fun was just malicious. There's no indication that fun was involved, and in fact, the painter is not selling the painting, so profit wasn't involved either. In any case, we wrote, Schutz is clearly responding to and seeking to direct the attention of the public toward an appalling crime. Her effort is an entirely legitimate and admirable protest against racist violence, with obvious political connotations in the present circumstances of anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim bigotry whipped up by the Trump administration. Hannah Black and her co-signatories see the world entirely through the prism of race. This blinds them to the decisive social realities. They echo those extreme Zionists and similar tendencies who use a history of racial or religious oppression just to justify their own reactionary communalism. And in this case, sinister attack on artistic freedom. And there were further, I won't burden you with too many, but there were further comments along the same lines. That, of course, is Emmett Till's mother, who in fact did not see it simply as a racial crime, but as a demonstration of the violence and injustice in American society as a whole. So these are two comments along the same kinds of sort of racialist lines. In the latest case of habitual boundary overstepping and cultural appropriation, painter Dana Schutz's work, Open Casket, has sparked controversy and outrage, so forth. The medium-sized painting depicts the battered face of 14-year-old Emmett Till. The artist uses smudges of paint and cuts in the canvas to reflect the brutality of Emmett's death mask, and then here, this is obvious sarcasm, because obviously what the commentary surrounding a 62-year-old brutal murder of a 14-year-old needs is the voice of a white woman from Brooklyn. Now, what is astonishing and telling is that the writer is so saturated with racialism that nothing about this final sentence makes him pause. Well, why shouldn't a white woman from Brooklyn have something to say about the murder of a black youth? Why shouldn't a black writer have something to say about the murder of a white youth? The notion that one should stick to one's own lane is one of the most noxious possible slogans. If artists, or revolutionaries for that matter, had followed that advice, there would be no world culture or modern society, in fact. And then this: why do white artists think that the only way you can discuss race is through the suffering of people of color? Dana Schutz's painting highlights this phenomenon. Schutz, a white woman, attempted to stir our collective empathy by painting the disfigured body of Emmett Till. But her identity, and likely her experience, is actually closer to that of Carolyn Bryant, the white woman whose lies led to Till's murder. I don't know if you know the case, but Carolyn Bryant was a clerk in a store in Mississippi, and she claimed that Emmett Till, who was the 14-year-old black youth, had flirted with her, had said something suggestive, and her relatives that demanded an apology. When he refused to apologize, they beat him to death. And it turned out in the end that she was lying. In fact, he had never said. She admitted later that he had never said anything. But in any event, this is an extraordinary remark. And if I were Dana Schutz, I would consider suing for libel. The notion that because she's a white painter, that she's identical with this woman who was responsible for a violent racist crime. The smugness and ignorance of such circles is almost beyond belief. As I say, these are layers saturated with racialism. And when we raise the question in this regard, that this type of view from its ideological and political point of view, the comparison to the Nazi racialist outlook, we are not speaking lightly. We're not saying these people are Nazis. But the outlook that, look, what did the Nazis say? Jews can't play German music because they are un-German. They're non-Aryan. German conductors were forbidden from conducting German music. Jewish musicians were forbidden from playing German music, that is Beethoven, Bach, from the mid-1930s because they were un-German. Well, from the ideological point of view, you're talking about the same kind of outlook. And we made the point that the program of ethnic or racial particularism in art and culture, which insists that the various peoples and nationalities are incapable of communicating with and understanding one another, is thoroughly repugnant. It's part of the Anti-Enlightenment tradition, which rejects rationality, democracy, egalitarianism, and universality. And I'll go into that somewhat later. Now, all of this stuff is circulating, as you well know, in the art world, in the music business, in Hollywood. the controversies about the lack or not of black and other minority nominees for the Academy Awards. Of course, in the academic world, I don't have to tell you, much talk about white privilege or male privilege, cultural appropriation. Now, racism is a serious issue in America, but the New York Times and the American ruling class are not interested, are not concerned with combating racial backwardness or prejudice, but with encouraging and exacerbating racial and ethnic tensions to divide the working class and weaken it. And no one should be a bit surprised. I mean, it's entirely logical that the people in power, the people behind the New York Times, the people who monopolize the wealth in this country should want to see the working class population fighting among itself. Nothing would please the rulers of this country more than the open eruption of ethnic or racial or religious conflicts. Now, gender plays a somewhat different role for fairly obvious reasons. To argue for the complete separation of males and females presents certain economic, social, not to say biological difficulties. Gender plays more of a divisive role in the academic world, in the professions where a bitter conflict for advancement is underway. It also plays a role in the efforts of the Democratic Party to present itself as a progressive party. After all, it had a woman as its presidential candidate. That she was a warmonger in the pocket of Wall Street made no difference to certain elements. Gender, like gay rights and other issues, plays a cynical role in American foreign policy. To justify its unending and bloody military interventions, the U.S. ruling class attempts to cloak its ruthless policies. It proposes to change this or that regime, any regime that stands in its way, and often on the grounds of their human rights record. That the new regimes are no better at democracy than the old ones never receives attention in the American media, or the fact that one of the central allies of the U.S. and its conspiracies is the foul medieval government of Saudi Arabia, one of the most oppressive and reactionary on the face of the earth. In fact, we would argue that the United States is a country deeply divided, above all, along class and economic lines, and that a handful of billionaires control the overwhelming majority of wealth. And that, of course, can be verified by the statistics. A report published in December by University of California at Berkeley economists Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, and Gabriel Zuckman reveals unprecedented levels of social inequality in the U.S. The report documents an immense redistribution of wealth over a period of several decades from the working class to the rich. The bottom 50%'s pre-tax share of national income has fallen from 20% in 1980 to 12% in 2014, while the income share of the top 1% has almost doubled to 20%. The wealthiest 1% now owns over 37% of household wealth, while the bottom 50%, roughly 160 million people, owns almost nothing, a merely 0.1%. That's America today. And of course, on a global scale, 8 billionaires, 6 of them from the United States, own as much combined wealth as the bottom half of the world's population, some 3 billion people. 8 individuals control as much as 3 billion people. Okay, this is the reality of modern capitalism, modern capitalist society. And the conditions of every section of the working class are worsening. The conditions in the inner cities are disastrous and have only gotten worse since the early 1970s, despite the presence of African American mayors in many of these cities. Millions of people in American cities have simply dropped out of the statistics. Police killings and brutality are a fact of everyday life. At this point, the position of young and middle-aged white workers is deteriorating the most rapidly. Of course, they're falling from a somewhat higher level. Job losses, the destruction of pensions and health care benefits, the horrifying drug overdose epidemic, the overall decline in life expectancy. These are all features of America under Donald Trump and the legacy of America under Barack Obama. But according to the media, race and gender are everything. Now, the socialist movement stands and has always stood for opposition to every kind of oppression and injustice. And we exert ourselves on the World Socialist Web Site in publicizing and encouraging opposition to every instance of abuse and violence. The socialist movement has, throughout the extent of its history since the mid-19th century, opposed slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and racism. There is no political tendency on the face of the earth with a comparable history. And in fact, every major dispute in our movement has ultimately risen between those who have surrendered to nationalist pressures, succumbing to their own ruling class, and those committed to internationalist and egalitarian principles. And this has been the case since the Communist Manifesto in 1847. The communists are further reproached with desiring to abolish countries and nationality. The working men have no country. We cannot take from them what they have not got. National differences and antagonisms between peoples are daily more and more vanishing, owing to the development of the bourgeoisie, to freedom of commerce, to the world market, to uniformity in the mode of production and the conditions of life corresponding thereto. The supremacy of the proletariat will cause them to vanish still faster, in proportion as the exploitation of one individual by another will also be put to an end to. The exploitation of one nation by another will also be put an end to. In proportion as the antagonism between classes within the nation vanishes, the hostility of one nation to another will come to an end. And in relation to the condition of women in society, of course, there is a long history as well. This is from Rosa Luxemburg, the great Polish-German Marxist who was murdered in 1919. And she points to one of the first great heralds of the socialist ideal, the Frenchman Charles Fourier, wrote these thought-provoking words 100 years ago. In every society, the degree of female emancipation, freedom, is the natural measure of emancipation in general. And since we're marking this year the centenary of the Russian Revolution of 1917, this is Trotsky. The October Revolution honestly fulfilled its obligations in relation to woman. The young government not only gave her all political and legal rights and equality with man, but what is more important, did all that it could, and in any case, incomparably more than any other government ever did, actually to secure her access to all forms of economic and cultural work. And the Bolsheviks, after the Russian Revolution in 1917, introduced the most advanced laws in the world on questions of marriage, divorce, abortion, joint responsibility for children, etc. Beginning in October 1918, the Soviet Union liberalized divorce and abortion laws, decriminalized homosexuality, permitted cohabitation, and ushered in a host of reforms that instigated a red sexual revolution. Now, the emergence of Stalinism in the late 1920s and 30s, a reactionary nationalist bureaucracy, put an end to those liberating efforts. In the United States, there's a long history of left-wing struggle against racism and anti-Semitism, revolutionary elements within the early trade unions, the industrial workers of the world, the early Socialist Party, later the early Communist Party, led the fight against racist violence, lynchings, frame-ups, from the Scottsboro Boys in Alabama in the early 1930s to the Civil Rights Movement. The intellectual backbone of the struggle against Jim Crow racism was provided by left-wing thought and left-wing activists. Racism, discrimination, bigotry, sexual violence, and every form of abuse, in our view, can be fought only through getting to their source in class society, the division of society into exploiter and exploited, the frictions and tensions and toxins produced by the crisis and decay of capitalism, and by unifying the working class against the entire system. Single-issue protest movements have a disastrous and disorienting history in the U.S., always leading masses of people back to the stranglehold of the Democratic Party and bourgeois politics. Now, it can be confusing, and we recognize that there is genuine confusion. But it would be wrong to mistake the current obsession on the campuses and elsewhere, and particularly in the middle class, with race and gender, with a genuinely democratic or progressive struggle. Rather, in many cases, what we're seeing is the increasingly unbridled ambition of various layers of the upper middle class seeking to leverage past or present abuses to advance their own interests. There is an objective economic basis for this striving. While broad layers of the working class, black and white, male and female, have seen a steady worsening, at the same time a narrow layer of African Americans and women, as part of the larger upper middle class, have done very well. According to this is an article from Huffington Post by the journalist on the right. According to Federal Reserve figures, the median net worth of the top 1% of white households is 74 times than that of the average white household. So there's, between the top 1% and the average white household, the difference is 74 times, which of course is disgraceful and outrageous. This is among the highest levels of income stratification between classes in the developed world. Yet the wealth difference between the American black household and the top 1% and the average black household is several times worse. As reported by MSNBC, the median net worth of the few black households in the top 1%, not so few actually, but in any case, was $1.2 million, while according to the census, median net worth for all black households was about $6,000. That is, a black family in the 1%, the top 1%, is worth a staggering 200 times that of an average black family. If black America were a country, we would be among the most wealth stratified in the entire world. And the same process, same general process, can be observed in the female population. Inequality among women is growing very fast indeed. In both the US and the UK, the percentage of total female earnings that goes to the top female 1% has doubled since the 1980s. In America, almost 200,000 women are earning $250,000 a year or more, and the average income within that group is a breathtaking $475,000. Among younger men and women with equal education levels who've also put in equal time in the same occupation, there are no gender pay gaps left. Inequality in average earnings isn't caused by glass ceilings. It reflects instead two things. First, the lives of non-professional women, that is to say, working class women, the vast majority, the other 80%, whose lives are very different. And secondly, it reflects the dilemmas faced by women when they have children and the choices they make. In fact, for the very richest, that's not a factor, but even for upper middle class women, having a child is an economic factor. Now these newly affluent elements want more, and they see as their rivals more entrenched white or male rivals in various fields and professions. And a bitter internecine conflict is going on in the academic world in various professions, in the media, in the arts and entertainment, a sort of ethnic cleansing, a conflict between upper middle class layers over what pieces of the capitalist pie they can grab hold of. We've recently written about the Black Lives Matter movement, to which the Ford Foundation has promised to channel $100 million over the next 6 years, which is not chicken feed. And the same movement which has announced plans to issue a black credit card. And this is the reactionary program of black capitalism. We stand opposed as a party of the working class to all these sordid maneuvers. We are hostile to all sections of big business, whether white or black, male or female. We do not consider the election of black or female capitalist politicians a step forward in any sense. We're utterly indifferent to the percentage of males or females, black or whites or Latinos on the boards of giant corporations, or whether there's a woman in the White House or an African American presiding over the bombing of defenseless people in Syria or Yemen. Again, just to substantiate, in 1960 there were an estimated 25 black millionaires. That number has grown 1,400 times. Today there are 35,000 black millionaires. On the other hand, according to the Pew Research study, 35% of black households have negative or no net worth whatsoever. Another 15% have less than $6,000 in total household worth. That's nearly 7 million of the total 14 million black households that have little or no wealth whatsoever. This is the stratification. And then here too. This is it, those who are pleased by these facts, that these average female CEOs were making more than the average male CEOs. Be my guest. We couldn't care less what these parasites make. These are exploiters. These are like General Motors here, Mary Barra, who lays off thousands of jobs, destroys communities. These are capitalists, whether they're male or female, and they're not doing too badly. So, as if you like, as an introduction, so what is the significance of this, in our view, for art and culture? Because I think it does have a profound significance and has a profound reverberation within the current sort of artistic and cultural circles. Because one of the issues I'd like to get to, and it may seem a very elementary one, but unfortunately it's one that we have to argue out at this point in history, Is it possible, referring back to the issues I raised before, for one gender or ethnicity or nationality to successfully create artistic works about another? Is such a thing even permissible? In other words, to put it more bluntly or concretely, because this is the issue that more often comes up at this point, is it legitimate or even possible for men to write or make films about women, and vice versa to a certain extent, although it comes up less in that regard? Is it possible or legitimate for whites to write or paint about blacks, and vice versa to whatever extent this comes up? And what are the implications if these efforts are not possible or permissible? Is there a racial or gender criterion in art? And what is the history of claims about ethnic or racial particularism? Claims, in other words, that different peoples are incapable of communicating with one another and that each national culture is absolutely separate and distinct, or significantly separate and distinct. Now, our answer to these questions is not a mystery, and I've already given some indication of it. The artist, in our view, has the responsibility to strive for the broadest, most universal truths. The genuine artist has the interests of humanity in mind, not this or that nationality or tribe or gender, and certainly not in the modern era. There's no national ideal that can bring forth art of the highest quality, or racial ideal that can bring forth art of the highest quality or importance in our day. We've long since passed the heyday of the national epoch, even in countries oppressed by imperialism. I don't mean, of course, that the artist can or should avoid treating the immediate, concrete, particular details of life. That's essential to his or her work. But the fleeting and immediate have to point beyond themselves toward the more general human condition, if the work is to endure. Significant artwork has always endured for that reason, because it transcends the immediate circumstances, rises above them, and speaks to the generalized conditions, social, psychological, moral, that exist within class society. It's why we still read Homer or Shakespeare or whatever other examples you want to provide. And it would be impossible today, for example, in the United States, in our view, to genuinely enlighten or move masses of people if a work were steeped in American patriotism or nationalism, for example. If such a work argued that Americans from every social class and background should unite against the common enemy, let's say the Chinese or the Russians or the Iranians or perhaps the Germans, such a work would not be effective because it would be so obviously untrue, so counters the real interests of the population. It would not be convincing, and in any case, no seriously talented person would undertake such a work. We have, of course, in the United States, and I don't have to tell you, militaristic, jingoistic, pro-CIA, pro-war films. By and large, although they may have success, this or that may have success at the box office, they do not have an impact, or if they do, they have an impact only on susceptible, less conscious social layers and appeal to the worst instincts. But none of the militaristic works about Iraq and Afghanistan, which are all fantasies in every case, all of them untrue. As we know now, Zero Dark 30, from the work of Seymour Hersh, was a complete fantasy. The killing of Osama bin Laden bore no resemblance to what took place in the film. The Pakistanis simply opened the door and said to the Americans, here's where he is. They walked in and shot him. The whole thing is just nonsense. But that doesn't stop anybody from... American Sniper 2, of course, is a fantasy written by a really fascistic man who enjoyed killing people, as he says. All right, so we have such works, and I don't think they resonate deeply or can resonate deeply. So there are two interrelated questions. Can one culture or gender understand another, and does it have the right to make artistic representations of the other? Now, I need to digress briefly to make one point. We need to distinguish, first of all, between absolute and relative truth, between understanding something relatively well, even very well, and understanding him or her absolutely. There's never a complete identity between our thinking or our artistic representations and the object we're thinking or making art about. Our thinking or imaging is always an approximation. The task is to make the approximation as accurate and profound and evocative as possible. And not every human experience, of course, can be grasped by every other human being. A friend of ours recently had a child and spent 18 or 20 hours in labor. And that's one experience I and at least half the population will never know. But even then, one would hope that the general idea presumably is available to me. Now, significant cultural, national, linguistic, or even regional distinctions obviously exist and will continue to exist. To a certain extent, these distinctions make life interesting. We all search out people and experiences different from our own. But these are relative differences, differences within a species we recognize as our own. In fact, we couldn't register the differences if there were not an underlying sameness, a profound point of connection. They wouldn't be intriguing or enjoyable or accessible in any way. It would simply be a blank. There'd be nothing there, nothing registering. Truly, nothing human is alien to us. We are all made of the same basic substance, of many of the same physiological and material needs, especially at this moment in history. Economic processes have leveled the differences enormously. But each of us is unique in the specific manner in which the different physical, culture, and social elements are arranged. And this is the significance of Leon Trotsky's brilliant comment in Literature and Revolution. Even if individuality is unique, it does not mean that it cannot be analyzed. Individuality is precisely the welding together of tribal, national, class, temporary, institutional elements. And in fact, it's in the uniqueness of this welding together, in other words, the way in which things are assembled, that individually lies, that individuality is expressed. So it can be seen that what serves as a bridge from soul to soul is not the unique, but the common. Only through the common is the unique known. The common is determined in man by the deepest and most persistent conditions which make up his soul, by the social conditions of education, of existence, of work, and of associations. The social conditions in historic human society are, first of all, the conditions of class affiliation. That's why a class standard is so fruitful in all fields of ideology, including art, and especially in art, because the latter often expresses the deepest and most hidden social aspirations. But in reprinting this quote, I'm particularly attempting to get at this first part, that individuality lies not in the utter uniqueness of people, but in the way in which common features are assembled. In any event, is there such a thing, for example, as entirely distinct black and white cultures in America? I would dispute that. Of course, there are distinct sources and interests, histories, and features. But blacks and whites have been painfully, tragically intertwined since the very earliest days in America. There's hardly a significant political document, either of a progressive or reactionary character, in the first century of this country's existence that did not directly or indirectly take up the African American presence, or overshadowed by slavery and the question of slavery. The Declaration of Independence, with its earth-shaking claim about the equality of men, which was only a promissory note, given the existence of slavery, and inevitably had to be fought out over the next 85 years, through all the debates and conflicts of the first part of the 19th century, to the Gettysburg Address and Lincoln's extraordinary second inaugural speech. And if you turn to American literature, the democratic, almost orgiastic fluidity of peoples is one of the major themes of Herman Melville's Moby Dick, with the slavery question certainly in the background, as it was to the entire American Renaissance of the 1850s. In Emily Dickinson and Thoreau, Emerson, later, of course, in Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn, the book that Ernest Hemingway said was the starting point for modern American literature. The vast cultural and intellectual impact of the Civil War, the bloody Civil War on figures like Theodore Dreiser, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and others. They were produced by an intellectual and cultural universe in which the Civil War and the subsequent rise of modern industrial American capitalism were the central and pivotal features of life. Of course, on literature, on music, on every aspect of life. And there's the obvious, unavoidable, and tragic impact of European culture on African American culture. And as the commentator David L. Smith points out, black literature must necessarily be a mixed mode growing out of European language and European literary models. The example of the spirituals, which derive largely from European hymns, should indicate to us that authentic black models can develop from European models. Similarly, Sidney Bechet, Coleman Hawkins, Charlie Parker, and John Coltrane, all of course great jazz musicians, took the instrument patented by the Frenchman Antoine-Joseph Sax in 1846, and that's he, the saxophone, and made it into an instrument that's now inseparably associated with jazz. Black musical expression is not limited to forms or instruments created in Africa, and this need not be the case for black literature either. Need not be and cannot be, even if it wanted to be. These histories are intertwined, as I say, tragically and traumatically, for much of the history. But I want to speak about, and this requires a certain, and I hope you'll bear with me, a certain amount of historical excursion, which will not be long, but I'd like to go briefly into this. Because in opposition to the racialism that we saw that I referred to in the beginning, that saturates layers, who think that it's, in other words, who don't even question the notion that blacks and whites shouldn't sort of write about each other, have nothing to say about each other. Well, where does that ideology come from? What's the pedigree? What's the intellectual pedigree of that kind of thinking? And I want to argue that the current racialist trends, those who argue that whites can't understand blacks and that Jews should not make films about Italians and that men and women can never produce successful artistic works about one another, has a very bad pedigree. And that they're taking up ideas that were associated with reactionary thinkers of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, thinkers associated with the Anti-Enlightenment, the Counter-Enlightenment. The only difference today, and it is a significant difference, is that these very reactionary racialist views are presented as left, as progressive. And we want to demonstrate that they are no such thing. And an important starting point is the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th century, the great intellectual movement that reflected the rise of the bourgeoisie within the old feudal society, ultimately the emergence of capitalism, based on, of course, great economic changes, major scientific developments, on the exploration by Europeans of the Americas, other parts of the globe. As Frederick Engels, the co-founder of the modern socialist movement, commented, in its theoretical form, modern socialism originally appears as a more logical extension of the principles laid down by the great French philosophers of the 18th century, the great men in France who in France prepared men's minds for the coming revolution, that is 1789, were themselves extreme revolutionists. They recognized no external authority of any kind. Reason became the sole measure of everything. Now, of course, the thinkers of the 17th and 18th century could not, any more than anyone else, go beyond the limits imposed upon them by their epoch. The kingdom of reason that they aspired to turned out to be nothing more than the idealized kingdom of the bourgeoisie. Bourgeois property and bourgeois equality before the law were the inevitable result. However, this is not to diminish their accomplishments or the implications of their thinking. And I just want to refer to a few things, a few points on the question of the equality of human beings and equality among cultures. Of course, one of the great figures of the early Enlightenment, of the radical Enlightenment, Spinoza, and this is as early as 1670, but all men have one and the same nature, it's power and culture that mislead us. And another great figure of the early Enlightenment, Fontenelle, argues that men have been the same in all times and places, that, quote, the materials nature has in her hands are always the same. She forms and reforms them into 1,000 shapes. The centuries have caused no natural difference to arise among men. Here we are then, perfectly equal, the ancients and the moderns, Greeks, Romans, and French. I mean, these are extraordinary thoughts. And this is the late 17th century. This is a comment by the great Russian revolutionary Democrat Chernyshevsky of the 19th century, but he's speaking about the Enlightenment. Are we entitled then to say that all races of people are identical, not only in their physical structure, but also in their mental and moral qualities? In the 18th century, that is during the Enlightenment, the opinion was widespread among progressive people. They spoke of the unity of human nature in very broad and strong terms. I think that's a beautiful phrase. And this is from a more recent book, but again, the author is speaking about the Enlightenment. If the people of the Enlightenment had an awareness of the pluralism of cultures, they retained a sense of the unity of the human race. People should be seen in their historical context, but humanity was one. People were rational individuals, and their weaknesses were a product of their environment and not of their nature. And again, this is a deeply progressive thought, which of course is one of the fundamental thoughts and tenets of the socialist movement. And finally, in terms of the Enlightenment, of course, one of the greatest figures, Diderot. Therefore, everything goes to prove that humankind is not comprised of essentially different species. The difference between whites and browns arises from food, morals, customs, climate. That between browns and blacks is the same cause. Therefore, originally there was only one race of humans. And then, of course, the great abolitionist and ex-slave Frederick Douglass, himself a man of the Enlightenment, very much steeped in the Enlightenment. I adopt the theory that in time the varieties of races will be blended into one. Let us look back when the black and white people were distinct in this country. In 250 years, there's grown up 1 million of intermediate, and this will continue. You may say that Frederick Douglass considers himself a member of the one race which exists. So, again, speaking very generally, now obviously I'm bringing together an enormous body and simplifying, but Enlightenment thought was generally animated by universalism, secularism, belief in rationality and science, hostility to superstition, confidence in progress, and the ability of human beings to eventually bring their lives under conscious control. Men and women were not wicked. The social conditions in which they lived represented the principal obstacle to human happiness. However, there is another current, and this is the current of the Anti-Enlightenment. The current that responded with deep hostility to the Enlightenment, deep hostility to the French Revolution, which tends to be national-minded, ethnic-based, traditional, religious, defending prejudice, focused on what divides humanity, irrationalist, hostile toward and fearful of the people, anti-democratic. We find a celebration of tradition, fear, submission, obedience. We are fallen creatures. We're guilty of original sin. And any efforts to remedy social ills will fail because human nature is essentially rotten. And here you have one of the prominent figures of the counter-enlightenment, of the counter-revolution in France, Joseph de Maistre. And I only introduced this first quote just to show what a charming fellow he was. All greatness, all power, the hierarchy as a whole rest upon the hangman. Now, he wasn't joking, incidentally. He's not pulling your leg here. This is absolutely serious. He is the terror and mainstay of human society. Remove this misconstrued, that is misunderstood, factor from the world, and instantly order will be yield to chaos, thrones will shake, and society perish. God, who created authority, also created punishment. Charming. But the point I want to get at is he is, in a sense, one of the fathers of multiculturalism. He writes, and this is a very famous quote, the 1795 French Constitution, like its predecessors, was made for man. And this is a very cynical and scoffing, but there's no such thing as man in the world. During my life, I've seen Frenchmen, Italians, Russians, and so on. Thanks to Montesquieu, I even know that one can be Persian. But I must say, as for man, I have never come across him anywhere. If he exists, he's completely unknown to me. Right? So there are only ethnicities. There are only national existences. Any universality among human beings is excluded. Okay? This is the tradition of the counter-enlightenment. Then, of course, you get another extremely reactionary figure, Arthur de Gobineau, who was a minor French count, the father of racist ideology. He wrote a very famous book, an essay on the inequality of the human races in 1850, 4 volumes. It's a gigantic book, which I don't think anyone reads anymore because its sociology and its anthropology is completely crackpot. But he established a system of hierarchy of races, white, yellow, brown. He had all sorts of theories. He was deeply disturbed by the French Revolution, by the Revolution of 1848, which was the first attempt by the working class to take power. He was revolted by the rootless urban masses. And Gobineau felt, quote, horror and disgust at equality and democracy. And of course, this is one of his famous insight. Passing from one induction to another, I was gradually penetrated by the conviction that the racial question overshadows all other problems of history, that it holds the key to them all, and that the inequality of the races from whose fusion a people is formed is enough to explain the whole course of its destiny. He had a whole theory about miscegenation, that he saw humanity doomed because races should be pure, but in fact they gain strength and sort of energy from mixing with other races, but that same process led to their destruction and degeneration. So he was not optimistic about the fate of the human race. A race degenerates because it has no longer the same blood in its veins because of race mixing and miscegenation. The human race in all its branches has a secret repulsion from the crossing of blood. Again, this is a man who was particularly violently hostile to socialism, to the working class, to the revolution of 1848. He had a theory of natural inequality. He had a big influence on Houston Stewart Chamberlain, on Oswald Spengler, and through them on the Nazis. He was not himself a violent anti-Semite, a racial anti-Semite, but his whole theory of racialism had a profound impact because he developed the whole theory of the Aryan race. You can thank Gobineau for this. And he had a profound impact on Hitler and the Nazis. Now, again, I'm obviously skipping over vast questions, but then there's the question of the apologies for racism in the U.S. And various apologies emerged in the late 19th and early 20th century on the grounds that whites and blacks were utterly distinct and no rapprochement was possible. And of course, this is the period of the 1896 decision on separate but equal, right? Plessy versus Ferguson, which establishes that as the federal precedent. And C. Van Woodward, who was a very great historian, says about these works, their influence was to encourage the notion that there was something inevitable and rigidly inflexible about the existing patterns of segregation and race relations in the South, that these patterns had not been and could not be altered by conscious effort. In one of these books, professor at Yale, very distinguished, respectable academic, William Graham Sumner, his book, his anthropological work, Folkways, in 1906. And his basic argument is that blacks and whites had distinct folkways, distinct traditions, and they could never be an intermixing, never could be the understanding between the races. In this way, folkways, folk traditions arise. The young learn them by tradition, imitation, and authority. The folkways at time provide for all the needs of life then and there. They're uniform, universal in the group, imperative, and invariable. As time goes on, the folkways become more and more arbitrary, positive, and imperative. In our southern states before the Civil War, whites and blacks had formed habits of action and feeling towards each other. They lived in peace and concord. He's describing slavery. And each one grew up in their ways which were traditional and customary. The Civil War, which he obviously regrets, abolished legal rights and left the two races to learn how to live together under other relations than before. But anyway, the argument was those relations were, impenetrable and absolutely inevitable. And then finally, in terms of a historical excursion, two nasty figures, Maurice Barrès and Oswald Spengler, one French reactionary and one German. French novelist Maurice Barrès said he was unable to understand the Parthenon or Plato because he had no Greek blood in his veins. As far as he was concerned, the Greek genius was impenetrable to a Frenchman. All that remains of truth is a multiplicity of national truths. Barrès spoke of a French truth and a German truth, a French justice and a German justice. Now this is a man who was a violent anti-Semite, anti-Dreyfusard, French chauvinist, and had a profound influence on the development of the French fascist movement in the 20th century. And of course, Oswald Spengler, author of The Decline of the West, or anti-communist, German nationalist, generally supporter of Hitler and the Nazis, although he also was not a biological racist, not a violent anti-Semite, but a very reactionary man. And he sums it up perhaps even more succinctly. Each culture possesses its own standards, the validity of which begins and ends with it. There is no general morality of mankind. Truths are truths only in relation to a particular human group. So you have this extreme subjectivism and relativism. Spengler thought any attempt at understanding between nations or any possibility of such an understanding was a sign of decline. For men who come to a different culture, its customs and morals are a deep secret and source of continual and pregnant error. Again, jumping to the more recent period, just on the question of postmodernism. and the micropolitics of difference. With postmodernism, and its subjectivism, its extreme relativism, its attack on objective truth, on historical truth. Each individual or people has its own narrative. This is rooted in German and reactionary subjectivist philosophy, an assault on objective truth, on Marxism and the revolutionary role of the working class. You have this statement, and these, of course, are Lyotard and Foucault. In the past 2 decades, the foundational claims of modern politics have been challenged by postmodern perspectives. The Marxian project of revolution, worldwide and global in scope, has been replaced in some quarters by more localized struggles and more modest and reformist goals. The result is a variety of new forms of postmodern politics whose discourses, practices, and effects are beginning to register and come under critical scrutiny. Within the motive theory, the democratic turn, and I don't think it's a democratic turn at all, involves a shift toward more multi-perspectival theorizing, etc., etc. In opposition to the discourses of the unity of absolute truth, postmodern micropolitics stresses difference, plurality, conflict, and respect for the other, so forth. So there's an obvious connection between this outlook and the growth of ethnic, racial, and identity politics. You have tendencies in the middle class rejecting the ability to make sense of the world objectively and to base one's views and politics on that objective assessment. Now, to conclude, particularly in the question of postmodernism and identity politics and its impact. What has been the impact of those tendencies on art and culture? And I think it helps to account for the very poor current state of arts and culture. There obviously are many interrelated factors, but the emphasis on self, on personal identity, on ethnicity and gender, the hostility to universality, to rationality, to historical and social generalization, has had a significant and damaging impact. The artist who begins from the conception that large areas of life are forbidden him or her, and that he or she is restricted to staying in his or her own lane, is virtually done from the outset. Art is inevitably and correctly drawn toward the broadest questions in life, the questions that concern human beings, toward the universal features of life. Imagine telling an astrophysicist or a mathematician that such and such aspect of the field is off limits. It's inconceivable. Well, art too, in its own particular manner, is involved in knowing the world. And art abhors such limits. Art abhors such half measures. It cannot work in those conditions. And it's not accidental that there has not been a single work in recent decades that one could point to and say, this sums up this period, or sums up life in the US. Think about it over the last 30 or 40 years. And there was a time when there were such works, whether it was the Scarlet Letter or Moby Dick or Huckleberry Finn or Dreiser or Fitzgerald. There were works that summed up, or films, certain films, that summed up a historical moment. There's been nothing like that in the last 30 or 40 years. A work that represents, that really grasps the whole, or important parts of the whole, not one. And the postmodernists and identity politicians have had several decades to show what they can do, and there's very little artistically to show for it. The worst period in the modern epoch, in our view, from the artistic point of view. We just came from the San Francisco International Film Festival. We saw numerous honest, sincere efforts, but for the most part, self-consciously small, largely passive. The artists are unprepared for, uncomfortable about anything but the immediate or subjective conditions. Where is the truly rich social or historical drama today? It's virtually non-existent. We live in a period of extraordinary, perhaps unprecedented, global drama and tension and upheaval, and where is that represented by artists? Where? I asked the question not rhetorically. I don't think there are significant representations. Believe it or not, artists once stuck their necks out. Tolstoy wrote a novel entitled War and Peace, 1,000 pages long, and he rewrote it 7 times. Today, by and large, artistic presumptuousness and ambitiousness finds expression in technological invention or bombast. One of the problems today, along with a terribly low level of social and historical knowledge, is the degree of skepticism and pessimism that prevails in artistic circles. And we are entirely confident, and historical experience is vital here, that the conditions that have accumulated will provoke a mass social explosion, and that will have enormous impact on art and culture. Every social class hesitates before making a great advance. I think we live in a moment of extraordinary confusion in the United States. People are at sea by the millions. There is a sense that the other shoe must drop. But what shoe? What's to come next? What will come out of this Trump administration? What will come out of the present drive to war? And there is a certain shock and dismay and a temporary paralysis, a popular paralysis. And all the old existing organizations, trade unions, civil rights organizations, so-called peace movement, have simply disappeared. The anti-war movement of 10 years ago is now the pro-war movement. So there's a paralysis, a temporary paralysis, and a hesitation in the face of great events. But that will give way to anger, to mass anger and mass action. And the ruling elite understands that. That's why it's arming itself to the teeth and trying to direct that anger, that social anger, toward other peoples, countries, toward Mexico, towards China, towards Iran, toward North Korea. What did Trump say in his speech? That those countries have ripped away middle-class jobs. Well, of course they haven't. It's the American capitalist class that has ripped away the millions of jobs. But he wants the workers to believe that it's the Chinese, the Mexicans, the Koreans who are responsible. And so there are many elements. There's much confusion. But I think that there are deep wells of democratic sentiment in this country, and we're on the eve of enormous social struggles. But in our view, self-pity and pettiness and selfishness and sort of ethnic obsession, gender obsession, have always been poor starting points for art, as everything else. The lives and thoughts of most artists at present, one has to be honest, are not all that intriguing. We would say, put yourself in your back pockets for a moment. Look at life more broadly, more deeply. Think about someone else. Think about the big questions, the burning questions that face millions and tens of millions of people. And I'm absolutely confident that is the direction in which art will move. Because the enormous social explosions that will come will break up the clouds of skepticism and pessimism. And there will be a revival, a cultural revival. I have no question, I have no doubt about it. In any event, this is the 100th anniversary of the October Revolution, as Toby referred to. We're marking it and studying it from the point of view of the social explosions, the revolutionary explosions to come. We make our appeal to the artists and those present in this room on that basis. And I thank you for your time.